Thanks, Craig. So should we kick off? My name is Matt Cook, and I'm chairing this roundtable for the History of Sexuality seminar at the IHR, but actually not. And I'm really excited about this session. It's a roundtable on the special issue Prostitution in 20th Century Europe, which came out with the European Review of History and emerged from two really exciting workshops on the history of prostitution in 2018 and 2019. And really excitingly, I just learned that this special issue will also appear as a book later next year, also with Taylor and Francis. So that's really, really wonderful news, and a real testament actually to the chapters and papers that it includes. What's so exciting about this collection is that it looks nationally and transnationally, from Italy to the USSR and between and beyond, and argues for the central place of prostitution in 20th century European history. And as such, I think this conversation, this roundtable, is going to be a really important and exciting one. The two editors, Siobhán Hearne and Sonja Dolinsek, are going to kick off with a 10-minute introduction. And then that will be followed by five-minute overviews of papers included in the collection. And so I don't keep intruding as we move through the different speakers. I'm going to briefly just introduce everyone at the outset in the order you'll hear them. And what I'll do is I'll pop back at the end of that section of the once everybody's spoken and field some questions and comments, which there'll be plenty of time for at the end. So do save those up. So first of all, Siobhán Hearne is a historian of gender and sexuality in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of Modern Languages and Culture at Durham University. Her first book, Policing Prostitution, Regulating the Lower Classes in Late Imperial Russia, came out with OUP in 2021. Congratulations on that. Sonja is completing her PhD project at Erfurt University in Germany on transnational politics of prostitution and anti-trafficking during the Cold War. She's currently working at Paderborn University in a data literacy project and learning about data and digital humanities, which I definitely need to learn more about, and is co-editor of the collection Prostitution in the History of Central and Eastern Europe. Yvonne Svanström is Professor of Economic History at Stockholm University and works on 19th and 20th century social and economic history, with a particular focus on commercial sexuality, domestic work, and the use of fiction as a source for studies in economic history, really fascinatingly. She's currently PI, Principal Investigator, for Between Free and Unfree Labour, Labour market relations and the welfare society in Sweden, 1880 to 2022, which is funded by the Swedish Research Council. Anna Hájková is Associate Professor at the University of Warwick.
Hájková.
Sorry, Anna. Hájková is Associate Professor at the University of Warwick, working on two projects. First of all, a study of transgressive sexuality in the Holocaust, and a generational history of communists in Central Europe, 1930 to 1970. Anna's article, Sexual Barter in Times of Genocide, was awarded the Catherine Stimpson Prize for Outstanding Feminist Scholarship in 2013, a real achievement. And since then, her first book, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt, has come out, and she's guest edited a special issue of the journal German History on Holocaust, sexuality and stigma, and much else beside. Finally, Nikolaos Papadogiannis is a research fellow and associate lecturer in history at the University of St Andrews. His first book was Militant Around the Clock, Left-Wing Youth Politics, Leisure and Sexuality in Post-Dictatorship Greece, 1974 to 1981. And he's currently working on the links between the growing mobility between Southern and Central Europe on the one hand, and the sexual transformations in West Germany and Greece in the 1960s and 70s on the other. And Nikos is also working on a transnational history of HIV and AIDS activism in Western Europe. So a lot going on there. So those are our speakers. I'm really excited to hear from all of them. And I'm going to hand over now to Siobhán. Thanks, Siobhán.
Thanks very much for the introductions. And thank you, Sonja, for getting our slides together. I'm just going to sort my own screen out. Excellent. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much to the IHR History of Sexuality seminar series for having us, and to Matt, Craig, and Justin for doing all the organisation. It's great to virtually be with you all today, and I'm going to begin by introducing our special issue by pulling out some key themes that Sonja and I explore in the special issues introduction, and then Sonja will also talk about some themes. So the first theme I'd like to discuss, the first one you can see on the slide, is beyond regulationism. So in our special issue, we really wanted to move beyond looking at the state regulation of prostitution, which tends to dominate in historical scholarship on commercial sex. State regulation was the preferred method for managing prostitution and preventing the spread of venereal diseases in Europe during the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And it usually involved the registration of women who were selling sex or believed to be doing so with the police, compulsory gynecological examinations for registered women, as well as various restrictions placed upon their movements, visibility and behaviour in public. In the interwar period, many governments across the continent abolished state regulation due to mounting public pressure, and because it was deemed to be largely ineffective at preventing the spread of VD. State regulation really looms large in scholarship on the history of prostitution because this intense state surveillance of women selling sex produced a wealth of documentation that is readily catalogued and in many countries readily accessible. This availability can make research in this particular side of the history of prostitution relatively straightforward, as files tend to be stored in collections related to national or imperial police forces, or in collections specifically on the regulation of prostitution. So while a researcher might find reams and reams of documents on state regulation, research in the history of prostitution after regulation proves a lot trickier, mainly because the apparatus used to monitor women believed to be selling sex disintegrated. So the contributors to our special issue have employed creative techniques to explore the history of prostitution outside this context of state regulation, combing through files on urban space, policing, medicine, criminology, tourism, as well as autobiographical sources and press. Looking beyond this context of regulationism also illustrates the meaning, value, and practices of exchanging sex and intimacy for material gain in contexts that have received to date little or no scholarly attention. And you'll be hearing some more from our contributors in a few minutes about this. So to move on to our second key theme, it's continuities. Many articles in our special issue also explore the ways in which prostitution and the bodies of those believed to be selling sex continue to be policed and regulated even when the state apparatus for doing so had been dismantled. Chronologies that are structured around ruptures of political and legal history often don't capture the contradictory rhythms and patterns of the policing of prostitution in Europe. Instead, our issue explores continuities in policing practices and the corresponding impact upon sex workers across 20th century Europe amid collapsing empires, regimes, revolution, war, and occupation. After the end of state regulation, police forces across the continent often look to other legislation or other social situations to continue the de facto policing of prostitution and the categorization of sex workers as a public nuisance to be excluded, stigmatized, and criminalized. For example, in interwar Sweden, vacancy legislation was used to this purpose, and Yvonne is going to talk about this in a minute. And in Cologne in the 1960s, sex workers were displaced from certain areas of the city due to being targeted by legislation regarding urban space. In the Soviet Union, so my area of study, women selling sex could be targeted by legislation criminalizing the spread of venereal diseases or outlawing parasitism. The stigmatization and social exclusion of women engaged in prostitution, combined with their categorization as a nuisance by the police and the direct and indirect criminalization of prostitution, continued to stretch across the continent in the across the 20th century, challenging narratives of growing liberalization in relation to gender and sexuality in this period. Now, the final theme I'd like to touch on before handing over to Sonja is exploring engaging with and resisting policing practices. Regardless of the political, geographical, or chronological context, the policing of prostitution required some form of collaboration between the police and the wider public in 20th century Europe. Given that prostitution was either regulated or directly or indirectly criminalized across the continent, there is ample evidence indicating that women selling sex have long employed strategies to avoid police detection in their work, such as altering their working locations in response to new policing initiatives, increased public attention, or technological advancements. In the 1950s and 60s, for example, sex workers in Cologne, Milan, and Riga met clients in liminal spaces like bars, hotels, public parks, and taxis, or even solicited clients on the telephone to avoid being noticed by the police, or also penalised under zoning laws. In light of this, the police often relied on the public to help detect, often deliberately concealed, evidence of commercial sex, and the public supplemented police work through denunciation letters, voluntary street brigades, or even by publicising photographs of sex workers and their clients. In contrast, some urban residents chose to help conceal prostitution, motivated by their own financial gain or their indifference to the presence of commercial sex within their localities. So now I'll hand over to Sonja to discuss our last two themes covered in our intro.
Thank you, Siobhán, and hello, everyone. So the next two themes are the gendered politics of labor and then the issue of trafficking and forced labor. It is still a widespread cliche that prostitution is the oldest profession in the world. However, sex work has rarely been ever recognized or regulated as labor, not even under state regulation, and certainly not after regulation was abolished. As many historians and scholars of sex work before us have shown, approaching sex work from an analytical perspective of labor is not just useful, but also does more justice to the realities and the people who exchange sex for money or other goods. Many categories can be used to describe these phenomena, from sex work, sexual labor, to sexual barter. And in the end, there is a question of whether prostitution, a term with highly negative moral connotations, should still be used, and why. While the degree to which the term sex work in historical research is an anachronism is debatable, taking a labor perspective on prostitution is not. This includes analyzing practices and realities of sexual labor, its organization, and local realities, also across policy regimes. The papers by Anna Hájková and Nikolaos Papadogiannis in our issue broaden the perspective on sex work and sexual labor by querying it. Historical research has mostly focused on women, cis women, and heterosexual sex work. This is partially because of the heteronormative policy approaches to commercial sex that targeted cis women, but also because these policies created an archival trail of record that mirrors the focus on straight commercial sex. Both Anna and Nikos center queer subjects and their sex exchanges, and thus point to actors and perspectives, but also sources that have been neglected in historical research on prostitution, and in both cases, the historiography of the Holocaust and the history of migration. Taking a labor perspective on prostitution also means analyzing the gendered, race, and class conceptualizations of what counts as acceptable work and what doesn't. What activities are deemed to be legitimate labor and which are not, such as sex work. As Yvonne Svanström showed in her paper, prostitution was not only not considered to be work, but work and forced labor were seen as an antidote to female prostitution. And this brings me to another theme in our issue, which is the question of trafficking and forced labor, which in this case are two separate issues. In the debates on trafficking that have been going on in the past 30 years, the focus has been on trafficked women for sexual exploitation and coerced or exploited sexual labor. While this is a core issue in the history of sex work that touches on the question of working conditions, in our introduction, we stressed another trail of the past where sex workers were victims of enforced labor for the purpose of punishment and re-education. According to gendered notions of domesticity and the dominant gender division of labor, women's natural place was often regarded as the home. Therefore, the solution to prostitution was often seen in projects of moral reform and re-education. There is no simple narrative on reform movements and their motivation to support the transition of women engaged in prostitution into a quote-unquote respectable life, but many attempts to re-educate women to perform acceptable femininity have often been closely connected to practices of forced labor and workhouses. The Magdalene laundries in Ireland represent the most long-standing institution that promoted moral reform through forced labor, but workhouses were common across 19th and 20th century Europe. In Germany, they existed until the 1960s. So despite the widespread evidence regarding the use of force and coercion in projects aimed at re-educating women who were selling sex, the dominant narrative of unfree labor in the context of commercial sex remains that of human trafficking. But as Julia Late, who is also here, and Philippa Hetherington have recently argued, echoing a growing body of scholarship in critical human trafficking research, the usefulness of human trafficking as a category of an historical analysis is questionable. And with this, I would give my word to Yvonne Svanström, and I'll leave the slide like this and then move on when it's time to show the slide. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this. It's a pleasure to be here, or be wherever we are. The article that I presented in the volume that we're discussing today concerned the interwar years in Sweden, mostly Stockholm, and the application of the vagrancy legislation on women and men, and in some cases ensuing sentencing for forced labor. Characteristics for how the legislation was used was that when men were apprehended, they were apprehended mostly for begging, and women mostly for prostitution. Although this shows, I would say, that the gendered implications of the legislation, but in many cases, the behavior that the police noted was the same, approaching seemingly unknown persons and striking up conversations. The definition of a vagrant was the person who idly wanders from place to place without means of sustenance, where the circumstances do not indicate that he is seeking labor, and the person who, without having means of sustenance, does not try to support himself according to his ability, and accordingly has such a manner that it's hazardous to public security, order, and decency. So then earnings from prostitution were useless to argue that the Vagrancy Act did not apply. They were immoral money from manners hazardous to order and society. Concerning how the authorities looked upon the explanations for prostitution, they went from work shy in the late 1920s to fully psychopathological explanations in the late 1930s, much in accordance with the then criminological and psychopathological research. So the 19th century immorality, in a sense, had become the 20th century pathological trait. And in that sense, it was irretrievable in a different way than it was in the 19th century. When it comes to the occurrence of warnings and apprehensions for vagrancy and prostitution, the majority of those were undertaken in the capital, Stockholm. Likewise, the majority of those sentenced to forced labor were arrested in Stockholm. The practice of the police, however, was discretionary, where the situation itself and the previous record of the women in question seems to have mattered. In that sense, the old tradition of denunciation mentioned earlier from the period of regulated prostitution seems to have survived. However, in the 19th century, most denunciations related to women having given men venereal diseases, whereas some in the 1930s were complaining about contracts that were not upheld. Clients were complaining to the police for women overcharging. The men were let go, and the women mostly warned for vagrancy. Finally, a few words on forced labor, the fright that was looming over the warnings for vagrancy to be sent down for forced labor. And now you could show the graph, Sonja. Thank you. Here we can see that the number of women sentenced to forced labor decreased, and that the number of informal warnings and warnings increased. The discretionary power of the police increased, but on the other hand, less women were transported to do forced labor. This is partly towards the end of the in early 1930s to do with new legislation on forced treatment for alcoholism that came in force, and as did the legislation that those under 21 could not be sentenced for vagrancy. Many of those few that were actually sentenced to forced labor were mostly alcoholics, and some probably should have been subjected to hospital care or mental institutions. As you can see, only a handful was sentenced each year in all of Sweden. If you compare these figures for the nation as a whole to the figures that reported that more than 400 women were regulated in Stockholm at the time of its the abolishment of prostitution, regulated prostitution in 1918, you can possibly deduce a couple of things: that women had left prostitution or become professionalized enough to not be sentenced and were among those who were informally warned. So to sum up then, during the interwar periods of 20 years, following a period of almost 60 years of regulated prostitution, the vagrancy legislation stemming from the Middle Ages was kept, but used for monitoring in an arbitrary way. Vagrancy had many moral traits, and especially female vagrancy was equal to prostitution. This under a period when female participation in public life increased, as did their sexual liberation. Forced labor was still looming as the final correction, and the sexual double standard was upheld. The arrests of women for prostitution under the vagrancy legislation and the anonymity of male clients continued even after the regulation ended. Thank you. So now I leave the floor to Anna.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Siobhán and Sonja, for bringing the volume to a successful end and for organizing the special issue. My remarks will be a little bit less formal and maybe also a little bit shorter, because it's also a pleasurable moment to think back 3 or 4 years ago when we were sitting in Prague in the Villa Lana, and I subtly and gently tried to encourage you not to publish a German anthology, but to go for a special issue, because then people can download it and can teach with it. And you did that, and rather than telling me to mind my own business. And I really appreciate it, because it was a lot of work, and some of us were late. I was also late, and you were very understanding about it. I had the good chance of workshopping this work at UC San Diego with Susan Hellman and with Zoe Waxman in Oxford. And I guess if I were to look back why I wrote the piece and what I wanted to do with it, is because I'm a Holocaust historian of Jewish history and the Holocaust, and I've been frustrated with how little have my colleagues in Holocaust history engaged with outside historiography of history of sex work, of prostitution. That has been absolutely the case in 2013 when I published my piece in Science. And while a lot of people have read the piece in Science, quite often they misunderstood it and misunderstood it as a piece on sexual violence, and kind of this non-engagement with sexual violence and with prostitution was ongoing. Now, many Holocaust historians have pointed out that Holocaust history sometimes tends to be a little bit positivist and has a little bit theory shy, which is also understandable, because after all, we are talking about a genocide. But I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of continue my pointing out to some very important insights that lead then to the core topics in Holocaust studies, such as issues of agency and whether the Holocaust victims had any meaningful choice. It was also the time when Mary Jarfitz, who I have the good fortune of calling my dear friend, published this beautiful book about Jewish women and migration in Buenos Aires and transnational Jewish history, and kind of the less desired Jewish history. And as Mary and I have been talking about how we need to introduce prostitution to Jewish history a little bit more seriously, that was also something that really framed my thinking and also pushed me to think hard about Holocaust exceptionalism, because the situation in which many of the Polish women in what was then the Russian Empire or the Habsburg Empire moved to Buenos Aires, sometimes knowing full well and sometimes not knowing what they're moving into. Actually, in many respects, was comparable with the Holocaust, of course, minus the annihilation camps. One thing that, there were two things where my thinking has developed since 2013, and I want to share them with you. The first one is the definition of rape versus sexual violence, and the second one is on consent. Because we know that sexual violence was extremely frequent in concentration camps, in hiding, in ghettos, and elsewhere. But what I suggest is to differentiate between rape as a moment of sexual violence where the victim has no moment of agency or choice, and then the much bigger umbrella of sexual violence, because sexual barter is very, very frequently violent, but because it's a barter, the victim has a moment of choice. They choose to engage in this often very hierarchical and dependent relationship, and therefore it is not rape. The other point is on consent, and I will come to it in a little bit. The other reason why I was keen to write this piece is that after I finished the piece in Science, I kept coming across material and also lots of colleagues who I just somewhat ungratefully criticized for not taking history of sex work on board, have very, very generously shared lots of sources with me, because these are often very marginalized histories, so are difficult to get by. Rebecca's hand is up. Maybe I should stop talking. Or should I not stop talking? Okay, I will just continue talking and Rebecca will figure out what.
I think if we could save up their questions, I think that would be
okay, good. Sorry, I was just like, if there's something horrible happening, I should stop talking.
No,
okay, I will continue talking. Where was I? Yes, I found lots of interesting sources. I had great materials, not only from Concerned to Theresienstadt, because of course I wrote my first book about Theresienstadt, as Matt mentioned. And I had materials from Poland and from Germany and from hiding. I had materials about enforced relationship with SS, about queer relationships between men, between women, just before the liberation. And I had also many more materials that raised poignant reminders about the boundaries of the narratability. Some of the topics I kind of looked at in the article, knowing that it would really deserve a book. And I'm not going to write the book because somebody who will write on it will need to speak, say, Yiddish or Polish. And I read Polish slowly, but not well, and I don't understand any Yiddish. And that is the story of Guta, the sex worker in Warsaw Ghetto, who we know about from Cecilia Slepak. And one big watershed that we had in the last 3 or 4 years is that Katarzyna Persson from the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, together with her colleagues, has started producing a beautiful Polish and English edition of the Ringelblum archive. And I hope that by publishing, one page about Guta in this piece, somebody will read it, say, actually, unlike Hájková, I can read Yiddish, I will go and dig more and write a whole book about this woman. And the other story is that about Herta Poppert, which is the story with who I'm closing. And sometimes when I hang out with friends and they ask me about my work and I get tipsy, I will say, I want to run away with Herta Poppert and hold her hand and have her babies, because she's this really, really fierce woman who also is incredibly altruistic and always takes care of the people around her, helping them to survive. She is also very quick and thinking around her feet, and she's able to come to terms with the news that eventually everybody is going to be sent to Auschwitz and to survive. And the second she and the people around her are liberated in Sweden, people did not forgive her how she paid, to use the language they were using for her survival and for their own survival. And they pressed charges with the Swedish authorities, and she's immediately arrested and then spends the next 18 months kind of negotiating whether she was a so-called collaborator or not. And with that, I come to the last bit, namely to the constant marginalization and to stigma. And as I proposed before, and I try to do it fairly systematically in this piece, rather than taking the stigma on board, we need to historicize it, and we need to analyze how it comes to be, how it's linguistically constructed, and we need to think very, very carefully how not to continue it. So I spent a bit of time in the article writing about this difficult and not very constructive phrase like selling her body or selling herself and so on. I promised that The other insight I had was about consent. And I think informed consent and any consent is very, very important in discussion of sex work. But my conclusion at this moment is that consent is not a very useful category for history of the Holocaust. And here I want to kind of echo what Sonja said earlier about kind of the trafficking conceptualization, because so many situations in the Holocaust, if not all, were marked by coercion and dependencies and impossibility of free consent, that we cannot really operate with free consent for the situations that are marked by sexuality. But we can talk about agency, and we can often find sexual barter, however enforced and violent, as moments of agency. If you want to understand the decisions of Holocaust victims, including teenagers, we need to take the decision-taking seriously and take them out of these often very marginalized and tabooized expectations that surround them. And that also means thinking a lot about narratability and how can we write about it as neutrally as possible. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to change, well, not change topic completely, but move into the international and transnational sphere. So my paper in the special issue is about the negotiations of the Anti-Trafficking Convention with a very long title. I'm not going to read it for now. The 1949 Convention, the fifth Anti-Trafficking Convention in the 20th century, and the for the 50 years after, no new convention against trafficking was passed. So this was quite influential, even if it wasn't ratified by that many countries. And interestingly, there wasn't any research about this until now, basically. And I approached this convention and the negotiation with the question of how they approach trafficking and how they approach prostitution. And as the title says, it's tensions of abolitionism, which basically points to contradictions in the context of the negotiation process, but also in terms of contents. So the 1949 Convention represents a watershed moment in that it creates an international legal framework on prostitution after 1949. It is an abolitionist convention in the sense that it contains measures that mandated the signatories to abolish state-regulated prostitution. It did not contain any measures addressing other fields of labor. So this is an anti-prostitution convention, arguably, and it is a convention that frames human trafficking as a subcategory of prostitution, as a necessary subcategories. And those of you who are familiar with the League of Nations narrative that state-regulated prostitution causes trafficking, that's the narrative that is behind the whole idea of passing the convention. There's also an element of moral condemnation of sex work, even though there is no direct criminalization. However, many of the countries that supported the convention said, well, our law goes further than the convention, and that is not in contradiction with international law, so we're fine with it. So in this paper, I focused only on NGOs, the relevant anti-trafficking NGOs of the time, and France and the UK. Only in some cases, I look at other countries. I look at the negotiation of 3 articles that focus on the criminalization of third parties, pimps, and people who rent workspaces, intermediaries, and so on. Article 6, which abolishes this state-regulated prostitution in the sense that it prohibits the registration of sex workers, and the social policy element of the prevention of prostitution. So you can see here that there is already a very broad reach of the convention, it combines repression through criminal law, a human rights inspired idea of liberating sex workers from police oversight, a social policy aspect, but more generally, it's a deregulating approach to sex work. There is an ambivalence in the convention, and I think that is what we can see in many countries that have adopted a regulation abolitionist approach, is an ambivalence about the social and legal status of sex workers after the abolition of regulation. And this is what I mean by deregulation. There is criminal law, there is social policy, social work frameworks, but there are no legal norms that address sex work per se, because that is penalized. It's not legal under this convention. And so there are consequences for prostitution policies to this day, which I think have so far not been connected to the effect of this convention, which is sort of the globalization of an anti-regulationist approach to sex work, which prohibits the regulation of recognition of sex work. And I think that there is even in the sex workers' rights movement, there's a hostility towards regulationism, understandably. But in a way, there is a tension between wanting to be recognized as labor and not wanting to be regulated. So, and this convention does not solve that problem, and it doesn't also give a way out to that dilemma. And also there's a conflation of sex work and trafficking, which is very visible in contemporary appropriations of the convention. It's often used as an argument for the Nordic model, as an argument to say that, well, prostitution is against human dignity, which is in the preamble. One thing that I also found out is who made the suggestion of describing prostitution as a violation of human dignity, and that was, as with in many other conventions of the time, the Union of South Africa. So it's not a progressive idea that was included in the convention. Maybe one thing that probably you're gonna ask me, since we just had to talk about the Holocaust, in the negotiation of the convention, any form of coerced prostitution, which we know about today during the Holocaust, did not play a role. If the war played a role, it was the post-war situation in which many women sold sex and were deemed to spread venereal diseases. So that was that. And I'm giving the word to Siobhán.
Thank you, Sonja. So my article looks at prostitution in the Soviet Union from after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 until the country's collapse and disintegration in 1991. It explores how female prostitution was indirectly regulated and directly repressed by the Soviet state, as well as the strategies that sex working women employed to circumvent state policies. Just a note on sources for this article, I worked with files from archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also, I mean, in my quest to have an image on the slide, I've put a horrific, horrible, blurry image of a microfilm in Moscow, apologies, but I wanted a visual. But I've also worked with files from the Estonian and Latvian archives to look at the case studies of the Estonian and Latvian Soviet Socialist republics and how they differed from state approach to prostitution in the Russian portion of the Soviet Union. But on the whole, at the all-union level, Soviet approaches to prostitution were characterized by a central paradox. The Soviet government claimed that prostitution had been eradicated because state socialism had eliminated the need for women to earn money through selling sex. But in reality, state policy and the conditions of Soviet socialism actually made prostitution economically advantageous and even necessary for many women. This paradox meant that state approaches to prostitution in the Soviet Union were characterized by de facto or indirect criminalization and often discussed very euphemistically in state discourse. So my article explores prostitution from the top down and bottom up. So to take the top down first, In the USSR, the exchange of money or other material remuneration for sexual services was not subject to any legal sanctions until 1987, but sex workers were heavily stigmatized throughout the entire of Soviet history. After the Second World War, in particular, party leadership consistently presented prostitution as something anti-Soviet and foreign, specifically Western, practiced only by those who chose to drop out of socialist society and engage in behavior that actively violated the norms of communist morality. This is quite different from the early Soviet period, so periods from around 1917 until the mid-1930s, where the Soviet government embarked on campaigns to rehabilitate sex workers into productive Soviet citizens through labor dispensaries. Sonja discussed this use of labor as an antidote to prostitution, but after the war, the approach was very much repression. Soviet approaches to policing prostitution from the mid-1950s onwards were orientated towards three key objectives. So the first was removing perceived threats to the social order from urban space. The second was preventing reputational damage to the USSR. And the third was ensuring that the Soviet treasury retained all of its assets. These objectives were especially pertinent in the decades after Joseph Stalin's death, which were coloured with a deep unease about the increased contact between Soviet citizens and foreigners. This was because from the mid-1950s onwards, Soviet leadership initiated dramatic shifts in foreign policy, moving away from Stalinist isolationism to encourage peaceful coexistence, knowledge transfer and competition with the West, and to promote Soviet socialism in the decolonizing world. Foreign tourists began to visit the Soviet Union, and visible prostitution threatened to shatter the carefully created images of happiness and abundance under Soviet socialism. Women who sold sex to foreign visitors in the Soviet Union were paid often in foreign, or in the parlance of the Soviet government, hard currency, which was a covered asset for the Soviet state given the weakness of the ruble in international markets. Intourist, which was the Soviet Union's travel agency, sold package tours to foreigners to the USSR, and these foreigners would pay in their local currency. The Soviet state also extracted foreign currency from tourists through confiscatory official exchange rates, as well as foreign currency souvenir shops, hotels, bars, and restaurants. So again, foreigners would always pay in their home currency, they would never use ruble. To ensure that the state had the monopoly on foreign currency exchange, currency speculation and exchange were legal under Soviet law, carrying a prison sentence of 3 to 15 years. From 1961, large-scale currency speculation was punishable by the death penalty. So in this context, so-called hard currency prostitutes, as they were referred to by the Soviet government, these were women who sold sex to foreign tourists, were extremely concerning because they challenged the state's monopoly on foreign currency. Now I'm going to move on to talk about the bottom-up perspectives on prostitution in the Soviet Union. In the next section of the article, I explore what may have attracted Soviet women to commercial sex, namely, in my argument, the Soviet state's inability to deliver on the social contracts by providing adequate housing, wages, and welfare benefits, particularly child welfare and disability benefit. Post-war material shortages and the deficit-based economy encouraged Soviet citizens to rely on the thriving second economy and other informal networks of exchange to make up for the deficiencies of state industry. A plethora of residence restrictions meant that residing in specific cities was only possible with official approval. And here we're talking about bigger cities, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and so on, or by circumventing the many bureaucratic procedures by trying to remain undetected and engaging in labour outside the state economy. One of these types of labour would be paid sex. So rather than a deliberately subversive activity, prostitution was just one of many strategies that women adopted to get the resources that they need under late socialism. In this article, I also look at the strategies employed by sex working women to avoid police detection in the Soviet Union. Drivers of state-owned taxis transported women who sold sex to remote locations for a fee, or even rented out their back seats by the hour to allow women to meet clients while in transit in the city's suburbs or around the city streets. Sex working women also met clients in secluded staircases, courtyards, or brought them to their crowded communal apartments. The lucrative nature of selling sex likely made engaging in prostitution worth the risk of police detection. And finally, Soviet officialdom continually overestimated police officers and urban residents' ideological commitment to policing prostitution. The Soviet state expected urban residents to form voluntary brigades to patrol the streets and detain any suspected sex workers, as well as report any suspicious women to the police. Now, some Soviet citizens did write denunciations and did patrol the streets, but the vast majority of urban residents chose not to do so. Like other elements of the second economy, prostitution, and especially hard currency prostitution, thrived in the USSR because of the compliance of the police, volunteer squads, and in-tourist employees, so people who worked for the Soviet Union's tourist agency. Sex working women were often able to pay bribes because of their comparatively higher incomes to ensure that they could continue to engage in paid sex. In fact, even when prostitution was made an administrative offence carrying a small fine in 1987, the Soviet police imposed only a handful of fines, perhaps again preferring to collect bribes and issue official warnings as they had been doing for decades before. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Nikolaos.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Siobhán and Sonja, for editing the special issue and for involving me. Thank you very much also to the IAHR for hosting me as well tonight. So my article explored a number of entanglements of 3 parameters, actually: sex work, emerging perceptions of gender transitioning in Greece, and the intensifying movement across space within Greece and between Greece and West Germany from the 1960s to the early 80s. So what I'm analyzing is a number of complex links, as I will shortly explain. What emerges in the 1960s and 1970s in Greece is what I would like to label as patterns of totalizing gender transitioning in that country. So up to that point, people labeled us, but also identifying with the term other face, which would be translated in English as effeminate men, would engage in gender practices that deviated from the gender assigned to them at birth, but only in specific settings. From the late 60s particularly, this changes to an extent, and a number of other faiths, what they do is that they claim an identity a gender identity that might differ from the one that had been assigned to them at birth, while aiming for this identity to encompass all elements of their experience. Now, sex work was crucial to this process, to those emerging patterns of gender transitioning. In the 60s and 70s, several so-called effeminate men were suffering from discrimination, even persecution in the places where they lived, particularly in rural Greece. So they rode on the wave of growing domestic migration from provincial Greece to the large urban centers, Athens and Thessaloniki. And once there, they found very difficult, almost impossible to find any other job apart from selling sex. So on the one hand, sex labor was to a great extent a forced choice, and also one involving several threats and violence, especially by the police and numerous passers-by. However, it was also, in an ambiguous manner, also an empowering experience, because it enabled them to experience with gender and engage in this totalizing gender transitioning. There comes another complex link. So in the places where those individuals sold sex, in streets in Athens or in particular bars, they met other people who also sold sex, and they discussed a lot about either traveling to Casablanca to undergo a gender-affirming surgery, or to move to Berlin, to West Berlin, where they expected a more socially liberal environment than in Athens and Thessaloniki, and the opportunity to earn more money than they did in Greece. However, what happened is that those of them who moved beyond the country, who engaged in cross-border mobilities, these mobilities did not necessarily accentuate this gender transitioning through selling sex. There were several trans women selling sex who, once they returned from Casablanca to Athens or Salonika, they tried to distance themselves both from sex work and from the neighborhoods where they had previously lived. Now, why this might be interesting historiographically, I try to engage with the main theme of the special issue, moving beyond the focus on state regulation by addressing the agency of those trans women selling sex. And this might be significant both for historiographical approaches, the so-called sexual revolution in the 1960s and 1970s in Western Europe, but also for the study of migration from Southern Europe to West Germany in the same period. Concerning the latter, I'm engaging with the notion of turn inwards introduced by Dagmar Herzog. According to Herzog, the late 70s witnessed a shift from sex being equated with pleasure to sex being linked more and more with anxiety and fear. Whereas for the trans women selling sex, I'm trying to analyze this combination of sex as both pleasure and a source of fear existed throughout the period in question, from the 60s until the early 80s. Moreover, and also to relate to a point that Sonja made at the very beginning of the talk today, the study of migration so far from Southern Europe, Greece in particular, to West Germany has a rather narrow understanding of work and labor. It focuses on factory work, whereas by analyzing, by exploring the agency of trans women selling sex, what appears quite clearly is that they viewed what they did selling sex as work, as a job. So I think that their consideration helps broaden understandings, conceptualizations of work in the study of migration in this era and in these geographical settings. The sources I have used is mostly ego documents, either published memoirs by trans women who sold sex in this period, or oral testimonies through interviews that I have conducted. Quite interestingly, there was a significant gap in the archives, both ones dealing with migration and with queer individuals in the period in question, as concerning those trans women selling sex. So I think that these ego documents help fill to an extent this gap. Thank you very much once again, and looking forward to the discussion.
Wow, thank you all for 5 really fascinating presentations. Yeah, applause all around. I think this opens up a really rich discussion. I've been thinking a lot about nation building and the way in which discourses of sex work get deployed in kind of shaping ideas of nation and in relation to the USSR in particular. I thought that was really, really striking. But can I open up to any questions or comments, and maybe we can come back to those thoughts later. Do people want to raise their hands if you've got questions or comments you want to bring into the